Plessy v. Ferguson is remembered as the ruling that enshrined segregation, yet it set off a cultural collision no one saw coming. In 1896, the Supreme Court ruled separate but equal, and accidentally created jazz. In 1897, Storyville's gaslit saloons offered steady work to any musician who could hold a note. The new red light district pulsed with opportunity, and two very different sound worlds were about to collide head-on. On stage, violinist John Robichaux, the same man who had led a full performance of Haydn's Creation at St. Louis Cathedral only 6 years before, drew his bow through a precise French quadrille, every note polished and correct. A few blocks away, cornetist Uddy Bolden stomped out a blues-drenched riff so raw it shook the floorboards. He pushed the tempo, bent the pitch, and let his horn cry with an abandon the Creole orchestras never allowed. The whole room tilted toward the horn. That night, the two sound worlds met in one packed saloon. Robichaux's strings wove their European lace, delicate and formal, while Bolden's cornet cut through it like a hot knife, and the crowd began to lean. The Creole tuxedo stood shoulder to shoulder with Uptown Sweat for the first time. Dancers turned away from the quadrille, their bodies answering the new rhythm that seemed to rise from the floor itself. By morning, the news spread through the community. The polite Creole orchestra had been eclipsed by a rough horn. The music would never sound the same again, and a new pulse was stirring in New Orleans. But long before that night, New Orleans was already a city of three separate worlds, held together by a fragile social order the rest of the South had never known. At the top, white Creoles and Anglo-Americans owned the banks, the newspapers, and the French Opera House. Below them, a distinct middle caste, free Creoles of color, French-speaking, Catholic, university-educated, and classically trained in their own music academies. At the bottom, English-speaking African Americans, descendants of the enslaved, crowded into uptown wards. Their music rose from field hollers and spirituals, a raw improvised sound that bent notes and shouted back at sorrow. And beyond the city, the cotton fields and the river fed the economy, but also carried the blues, a steady hum that seeped up from the docks into the uptown dance halls. For decades, these three tiers stood apart, each with its own institutions and its own music. It took a court case to smash the middle and force the clash. The collision, when it came, would give the world a new music. Three separate worlds, each with its own identities, stood on the brink of being forced together. In that downtown world, the French Opera House on Bourbon Street still glowed with gaslight, and Creoles of color filled its velvet seats to hear Parisian scores imported fresh from Europe. Inside, clarinetist Alphonse Picou drilled scales for hours, his fingers chasing a flawless articulation and the pure, rounded tone that European conservatories demanded. That music lived on the page, every phrase notated, every crescendo marked in ink, a tradition built on precision and the written note. Across town, Buddy Bolden sat on his porch, blowing a cornet that wept and shouted, bending every long tone with the moan of a street corner blues, never reading a single bar. The two traditions ran like separate railroads, one sleek and European, the other raw and American, never destined to meet until the law erased the middle ground entirely. In Baton Rouge that same summer, legislators gathered beneath the state capitol dome to pass a railroad law of their own, Act 84, the Separate Car Act, mandating equal but separate accommodations for white and colored passengers. The morning edition landed on doorsteps across New Orleans, the headline spreading through the Creole faubourgs like a tremor. For generations, light-skinned Creoles of color had navigated a fluid middle ground, educated, propertied, French-speaking, Catholic, deferred to in ways English-speaking African Americans were not. Now, a single printed phrase threatened to collapse that intermediary status into one blunt legal category: colored. In parlors across the 7th Ward, families gathered around oil lamps, reading the words aloud, the weight of the news settling into the upholstered silence. Overnight, the most ordinary act, stepping onto a train, became a border checkpoint. A conductor's glance could now reduce a lifetime of distinction, a family's French surname, to a sign hanging above a wooden bench. Act 84 did not simply divide white from black. It dismantled the entire architecture of Creole exception, the careful gradations of color, education, and culture that had shaped downtown life since Reconstruction. 2 years after the Separate Car Act, on June 7, 1892, Homer Plessy, a light-skinned Creole shoemaker, walked into the Press Street Depot to ignite a test case. He bought a first-class ticket and stepped aboard the whites-only car, as if the law did not exist. When the conductor collected his ticket and asked whether he was a colored man, Plessy answered plainly that he was. The conductor froze. Under Act 84, a passenger who looked white but admitted African descent had just violated the law inside that very carriage. A detective, planted by the Comité des Citoyens, rose from a nearby seat and moved toward Plessy. The arrest was swift and silent. Plessy offered no resistance. The entire confrontation had been scripted to expose the absurdity of a color line that could turn ancestry into a crime. The activists had handpicked Plessy because his light skin made the law's logic collapse. A man who could easily pass was being led off a train for declaring himself black. The arrest was not simply a challenge to a railroad regulation. It was an assault on the entire Jim Crow architecture. That afternoon, a shoemaker became the spark for a Supreme Court battle. Before any verdict, the tremors were already shifting New Orleans' fragile caste lines, and the aftershocks would soon reach the dance halls and parade grounds of the city's musicians. Behind that carefully staged arrest stood the Comité des Citoyens, a group of Creole of color lawyers, journalists, and property owners who had spent years planning a direct challenge to Jim Crow. They financed the arrest, secured bail, and steered the case through Louisiana's courts with one clear goal: to force the U.S. Supreme Court to overturn separate but equal. While the case wound through state tribunals, their attorneys crafted constitutional arguments that the Separate Car Act violated the 13th and 14th Amendments. Every brief and testimony was designed to escalate the question all the way to Washington.
One drop was enough to make you black.
In 1894, with the appeal climbing, Louisiana legislators struck their own blow. They amended the racial definition, declaring colored any person with even an appreciable mixture of African blood. The one-drop rule was now state law, erasing the loophole that had allowed Creoles to pass as white. The reclassification legally erased the intermediate Creole caste that had existed since colonial times. In an instant, families who had owned property, voted, and played hide-in in the cathedral were legally no different from the descendants of the enslaved. The committee's test case now confronted a law that made Plessy's light skin irrelevant. Their only remaining hope was the Supreme Court, where 9 justices would soon decide whether a citizen's ancestry alone could strip him of his rights. 7 of those 9 justices answered yes. On May 18, 1896, the Supreme Court handed down Plessy v. Ferguson, a 7-1 ruling that declared state-imposed segregation did not violate the 14th Amendment. Separate but equal was now the law of the land. Justice Henry Billings Brown wrote that enforced separation did not stamp the colored race with a badge of inferiority. It was, he insisted, merely a matter of social policy. For Creole families who had built opera houses and funded philharmonic societies, the news landed like a gut punch. The print on the page erased a century of middle ground identity. Overnight, the separate schools, the exclusive trades, the box seats at the French Opera were revoked. A child turned away from a whites-only schoolhouse now belonged to the same legal category as the descendants of slaves. Within months, classically trained Creole musicians found themselves competing for the same jobs as the raw blues improvisers from Uptown. The law crammed conservatory and street corner band into the same crammed rooms. The court had intended to divide. Instead, it fused two musical civilizations. That ruling, meant to keep races apart, would ignite the most collaborative sound America ever produced. The change was immediate. Creole citizens who had once occupied opera boxes now boarded colored streetcars, their refined suits and hats marking a world they were forced to abandon. The ballrooms that had once welcomed Creole orchestras for white society, dances stood empty. Their chandeliers gleamed over vacant music stands, while the musicians who had filled those spaces looked for work elsewhere. They found it in the same colored dance halls and picnic grounds where uptown brass bands already ruled. On makeshift bandstands, violinists in tailcoats stood beside cornet players in vests. The polished score meeting the raw improvisation for the first time. The collision sparked something electric. Dancers, Creole and African American together, poured onto the floor, their bodies responding to a music that was neither strictly composed nor purely improvised, but something new and alive. The court had erased a middle caste, but on those bandstands, a new middle ground was being forged, one measure at a time, out of violin bows and brass bells, out of opposing traditions that suddenly couldn't stop listening to each other. Those forged bandstands burned brightest inside Storyville, the legalized red light district, where the law's rigid lines dissolved into a haze of cigar smoke and syncopation. Opened in 1897, its 20 blocks of cabarets and sporting houses swallowed the old dividing lines whole. Inside the gaslit halls, Creole ensembles brought their satin-trimmed precision, violins, cello, and piano that had once accompanied Haydn. These were players who could read any score at sight and wore their European training like a second skin. Through the back door came the uptown brass bands, hauling horns that bent notes into blue cries and syncopations you could feel in your spine. They couldn't read a sheet of music, but they carried the whole history of the fields and the sanctified church in their breath. They shared the same stage, trading phrases. A violinist's arpeggio met a cornet's smoky glissando, and the boundary between high art and street cry crumpled into a single, urgent conversation. Dancers, Creole and African American together, surrendered to the new rhythm, their bodies dissolving the color line into sweat and motion. What emerged was neither polite quadrille nor raw field holler, but a third sound, urgent, rhythmic, and irrepressibly new. And that sound found its first true champion in a barber from uptown. Buddy Bolden lifted his cornet and gave it a voice that was entirely new. His band pushed past polite string orchestras. Tempos quickened until dancers leaned into the beat, breathless and alive. Bolden bent notes into human cries and saturated every chorus with the blues. Musicians who heard him declared he had invented a style no one had played before. They said his horn could carry clear across Lake Pontchartrain, a raw, soaring cry that pulled you out of your seat and onto the floor. That unrecorded but unforgettable sound became the blueprint. A decade later, the world would have a name for what he created: jazz. That blueprint reached the Storyville parlors, where a Creole pianist named Jelly Roll Morton, born in 1890, raised on French opera and Chopin, sat down at an upright piano and began to absorb the raw street rhythms pulsing through the district.
I had to work like a horse to learn the blues.
He insisted, and in 1915, he published Jelly Roll Blues, widely considered the first published jazz composition, a piece that married the classical precision of his Creole training to the stomp and swagger of the Storyville dance halls. Further downtown, a young Sidney Bechet, born in 1897 to a Creole family of craftsmen, was mastering the clarinet through relentless conservatory drills, his fingers tracing the same European tradition that Morton had studied. But Bolden's sound had traveled. It reached the conservatory, and young Bechet began bending those classical notes, pushing air through the reed with a wailing, blues-drenched passion no exercise book had ever taught him. On soprano saxophone, he became jazz's first great solo voice, a sound that carried the polish of the French opera house and the cry of the uptown streets in a single breath. Their compositions bridged 2 centuries. That bridge now carried the music far beyond New Orleans. The court case had erased a middle caste, but it also threw Creole violinists and uptown cornetists onto the same bandstands, igniting a musical fusion that would not stay put. In 1914, the original Creole band, Freddie Keppard's group, packed its horns onto the Pantages vaudeville circuit, bringing the polyphonic riot of Storyville to theaters from Chicago to Los Angeles. From that single hotspot on the Mississippi, the sound radiated outward along rail lines and touring routes, transforming polite dance music into something looser, bluer, and utterly American. A century later, in jazz clubs around the world, the bent note and the syncopated beat still carry the DNA of that forced collision between Creole precision and the uptown cry. What the Supreme Court built to segregate, the music erased note by note, measure by measure, turning a legal weapon into a cultural bridge. Jazz became the democracy that segregation could never silence, a living proof that the most beautiful accidents sometimes come from the ugliest laws. If you want to hear the next story, subscribe.